The Washington Commanders aren't getting a lot of top 10 rankings these days, but they did when it came to Pro Football Focus's salary cap health projections. We're going to dive into that and what it might mean moving forward right now on Locked On Commanders.
Your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome into this Thursday episode of Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day every day. And don't forget that you can subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can continue the conversation over on Subtext at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders with me, David Harrison, because I am your host at dharrison82 on Twitter, credential member of the media and Washington Commanders beat reporter for Commander Country, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site covering the Washington Commanders. Here with you every Monday through Friday, along with our everydayers. And as always, I appreciate your continued support for the show. On today's episode, we're going to talk about 4 young players who could be catalysts for certain veterans departing the franchise in the relatively near future. And we'll talk about how Ron Rivera has been one of the better drafters over the past few seasons. And we're going to start off today's episode, though, talking about salary cap health, because that's really where the whole thing kind of gets kickstarted. And this is all courtesy of Pro Football Focus, who did a 3-year analysis for all 32 NFL teams in their current salary cap situations and how those situations project to, again, the next 3 seasons, right? So overall, Washington ranked number 9th in the National Football League. So pretty good, a top 10 ranking in salary cap health, right? And PFF's Brad Spielberger, who did the article, said of Washington, quote, Washington's string of 4 straight first-round defensive linemen has gone about as well as the franchise could have hoped for. Deron Payne signed a monster extension. Jonathan Allen put pen to paper on a new deal. Montez Sweat is entering his 5th-year option season, which turns all the attention to Chase Young, end quote. Now, obviously, we know Chase Young's 5th-year option was declined. So out of the 4, I guess you would say that Chase Young's career has kind of gone the least like the Washington Commanders expected it to. Of the 5, 2 of the 4 have new contracts, so they're playing on Montez Sweat again, playing on his 5th-year option. Now, how did PFF get to the number 9 overall ranking for Washington when it came to salary cap health? Well, they used 5 different categories and individual metrics that they measured and then combined those all. So one of the metrics, top 51 veteran valuation, that ranked number 17th overall. Active draft capital, the Commanders came in 10th overall. 23 to 2025 salary cap space, they came in 8th overall. Total prorated money, 7th overall. 2024 free agent valuation, 31st overall. So that's the only place where the Washington Commanders came in a little bit negative. Now, understand that this number 9 ranking, right, isn't a ranking. You're not adding 17, 10, 8, 7, 31, dividing it by 5 to get their ranking. Instead, what they did is they took these numbers and they created a mean, right? So an average in the National Football League of top 51 veteran valuation. And then they counted how many spaces you were from the mean. So for 17, if the mean is 16, the Commanders got a score of +1, not a score of 17. And then average draft capital, or active draft capital rather, they're number 10. So you're -6. So between the +1 and the -6, you're -5. Divide that by 2. You're -2.5, and then you go through that for all 5. You stack and rank everybody, and the Washington Commanders came out 9th overall. Now, where they ranked the highest in this category, number 7 overall, like we just mentioned, prorated money. What is prorated money? Well, basically, we're talking about bonus money, right? Bonus money is prorated over a certain amount of years. Usually, those are signing bonuses. So when you hear a player sign a contract with a $25 million bonus, if that $25 million signing bonus is on a 5-year contract, then that bonus is, at least for cap purposes, is spread out through those 5 years. So it's $5 million a year in signing bonuses for those 5 years. Now the player is going to get all $25 million up front. Like once he gets paid it, and sometimes that can take 12, 15 months, but once that contract bonus is paid, it's paid at $25 million. So if I sign a contract in 2023 with a $25 million signing bonus for 5 years, that contract may run 5 years, but in 2023, I'm going to get my $25 million. For bookkeeping purposes, the NFL teams get to spread that out. So that's your prorated money. Usually that money's it can't be reduced, right? So that's why PFF uses that as a weighted category in this evaluation. Now it can be added to restructures, right? So if I've got $5 million a year they can decide to turn, hey, we're going to turn 10 more million in year 3. We're going to turn $10 more million of your money into bonuses. So now over the next 2 seasons, I'm going to tack on $5 million each. So my last 2 seasons will actually have $10 million in bonuses, thanks to the extensions or the restructures or what have you. So either way, this money isn't getting lower, right? And if it does go lower, it's going to be because you replace or you didn't replace, release the guy, and the remaining bonuses all come to roost earlier rather than later. So that only thing that's going to happen to that money is it's going to go up. It's never going to go down. It's only going to go up. So PFF considers this locked in cash, so they weigh it for these purposes and these evaluations. Now, Washington in that prorated money category has $139.29 million in prorated money over the course of the next 3 years on the books. That's 2023, 2024, 2025. The most in the NFL is the Philadelphia Eagles. So they rank 32nd because more is bad, right? So that's 32nd in the NFL. The Philadelphia Eagles, who are on the books for $513.49 million over the next 3 years, close to $400 million difference from the Washington Commanders. And then the best team in this metric, this prorated money metric, are the Chicago Bears, who are number 1, scheduled to pay $84.69 million over the next 3 years. But if you look at the Bears roster, a lot of kind of homegrown players, only a few free agents that were signed mostly this year. So that's why you get those numbers there. And some of those guys signed 5-year contracts. So the next 3 years, only a portion of their bonus payouts, right? Where the Washington Commanders finished worst in this valuation was 2024 free agent valuation. And look, right off the cuff, part of that is the fact that Chase Young and Montez Sweat are both playing on expiring contracts. So PFF says that this is a projected number based on the amount of free agents each team has, the value of those players, and the growth of those potential contracts. Now, this is the most opinionated part of this analysis, right? Because it's rooted in some historical representations. For example, Dallas Cowboys quarterback Dak Prescott missed nearly all of 2020, and then he got the largest contract any quarterback has ever gotten in guarantees in the 2021 offseason. So some of this is potential talent and all that stuff. But they're basically measuring the typical growth in contracts for a player at a position, plus what they perceive, PFF perceives this specific player's value to be. They don't list the individual players, so I don't know what value they gave to Chase Young, for example. But basically, they're using some historical data. This isn't just throwing darts at a board. But when they do this, Washington comes up 31st overall. But again, when you average the deviation from the mean in all 5 categories, they come in 9th overall, which is by far a better ranking in most things than they have done. So what does this really mean? Well, it means that Ron Rivera has been doing a pretty good job, at least during his tenure, of managing the salary cap. And to some extent, do you want to pay guys? Do you not want to pay guys? That's where some of these discussions come into. So let's go deeper into these numbers and talk about what I believe is the biggest reason Washington's salary cap health is so good. That's contributions from players on their first contract. So we'll talk more about that coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Commanders is brought to you by FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting Major League Baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you will land $200 in bonus bets, whether you win or whether you lose. The Washington Nationals are scheduled to host the Cincinnati Reds on Thursday afternoon. Left-handed pitcher Mackenzie Gore is on the mound for the Nats. Fellow lefty Brandon Williamson on the mound for the Reds. And if you make the right bet on that game, then not only could you win some cash, but even if you lose, you'll still get 10 times your money back in the form of free bets up to $200 if it's your first bet with FanDuel. That's $200 you can then spend on everything from money line to the over-under to who thinks they hit the first home run. You can even spend it on Commanders wagers if you want to do that. And it's all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on Major League Baseball than at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Thanks again out there for making Locked On Commanders your first listen or your first view of the day, today and every day. Every dayers, appreciate you coming back. We appreciate you being here through the rest of the week. We've got one more episode before we wrap up this week, and then we'll come back next week with a whole new slate of episodes. Real quick, I want to apologize for missing our Wednesday drop. I was planning, even though Tuesday was the 4th of July, I did have every plan to record an episode for you guys and drop it on the 5th. But all the family events, you know how these things go, right? You have kind of a schedule, and then one thing happens, gets delayed and pushes back. And the next thing you know, everything's getting pushed back. Just couldn't find the time to lay down that episode. So I do apologize. I did plan on coming through for you. I hope to be better in the future. But talking about being better, the Washington Commanders have actually been pretty stinking good when you're talking about draft history. And that, of course, you got to give a hat tip to Ron Rivera. He may not be the quote unquote general manager of this team, but like Martin Mayhew told me in the pre-draft process, when decisions have to be made in the draft room, it's Ron Rivera's decisions that's being made. And I think that is the biggest reason. We talked about the PFF ranking the Commanders' salary cap health when projected over the next 3 years as being the 9th healthiest in the National Football League. And of the 5 categories they use to evaluate the cap situation, Washington ranked highest in prorated money. That's amount, money owed against salary cap and player bonuses, but also came in top 10 in active draft capital. And that is where I think this is where we really need to expand on this conversation. For this active draft capital conversation, PFF created a tiered value chart the same way we do with draft pick values heading into NFL draft weekends, right? And then they compiled scores for all those players who were still on their rookie contract. So, for example, the one that they gave, PFF gave Bryce Young, number 1 overall pick, quarterback for the Carolina Panthers, has a value of 3,000 points, but so does the number 1 overall pick from each individual draft that you're talking about here. So essentially, this means of all the 32 NFL teams, the Commanders have more first contract players on the roster than 22 other NFL teams. And that's pretty good, right? And just like these other individual categories that PFF use as standalone metrics, some of them also spill into others. So we're going to talk about that here in just a second. For example, the more contributions a team is getting from rookie contract players, the fewer veterans that team is going to need to sign. And also the fewer veterans that team needs to re-sign. More on that, like I said, in just a little bit. So who are these rookie deal players contributing to Washington and getting them this high rank? Well, obviously the entire 2023 NFL draft classes, because they just got here and nobody's been cut and all these other things, right? But not all those guys are going to make the active roster. So when I'm stacking the Commanders against other teams, I'm really not using 2023 yet because we haven't seen what these guys are going to be even in the first week of the regular season. When you look at 2022, the entire draft class is still here with the Washington Commanders. I know some people might say, well, no, duh, they just got drafted. But I'm telling you, there are teams that have already lost, waived, released 2022 NFL draft picks. Some of them have waived, released multiple 2022 NFL draft class. So the fact that the Washington Commanders have their entire 2022 class intact on the roster, it's not amazing, but it's still something worth noting. Now, not one player in last year's class was released, but all of them contributed to the team as an active player at one point or another. Now, 2 of them very minimally, right? 7th round pick Chris Paul was active for the final game of the year and is expected to be a second string guard this season. So his contributions this year certainly expected to be more than they were last year. Second round defensive tackle Fedarian Mathis was active for the first game, would have been a much bigger part of the defense had he stayed healthy, but unfortunately he suffered an injury against the Jacksonville Jaguars very, very early in that game. Might have even been the first or second snap. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but injured very early in that game, lost for the rest of the season. So that's 8 rookies or 8 rookie contract players, right? And that's why we got to remember it. When I say rookie contract, I'm talking about guys that are just on their first NFL contract. They're not necessarily rookies, but they're on their first contract. So that's 8 guys right off the bat from the 2022 class. Now, looking at the other NFL draft classes, rookie deals will run for 4 years unless you're a first-round pick whose 5th-year option gets picked up, like Montez Sweat, then it's 5 years. When you look at players still contributing in Washington for their first contracts, we got to look back 4 years. Now, on scheduled contracts this offseason would have been from the 2019 draft class. So the 2019 draft class, you play the 2019, 20, 21, 22 seasons. 22 last year, 2022 last year was your final year of your contract. You could look at guys like Terry McLaurin was coming into a contract year. So if they're still with your team here in 2023, they're no longer on their rookie deals, right? Unless you're talking about first-round pick Montez Sweat, who is on his 5th-year option, still a part of his rookie deal. So we need to start looking, but basically at the 2020 NFL draft class to talk about measuring the rookie contract contributions for the Washington Commanders. Now, the 2020 NFL draft class, the Commanders drafted 8 players: Chase Young, Antonio Gibson, Sadiq Charles, Antonio Gandy Golden, Keith Ishmael, Khaleke Hudson, Kamren Curl, and James Smith Williams. 6 of those 8 players are still with the team. Only Keith Ishmael, and Antonio Gandy Golden are no longer with the team. 6 of the 8, the same 6, have a reasonable expectation to be active on game day this year. I would think that the only one really is Khaleke Hudson, who may or may not be active for every game this season. We'll see how training camp goes and all that. 5 of the 8 are expected to have significant roles on the 2023 roster. James Smith-Williams is a very valuable rotational player. Khaleke Hudson, special teamer. I would say he's the only one that I would put outside of the significant role. But either way, you still got 6 of these 8 players. This is their 4th season, right? 2020 is their first, 1, 2, and 3. So this is their 4th season. So 6 of these 8 players are still with the team 4 years later. That's pretty impressive. 2021 NFL draft class, the Commanders drafted 10 players: Jamin Davis, Sam Cosmi, Benjamin St-Juste, De'Ami Brown, John Bates, Derek Forrest, Cameron Cheeseman, William Bradley King, Shaka Toney, and Dax Milne. All 10 are still with the team. Now, Shaka Toney is suspended for 2023, so there's a little bit of an asterisk there, right? But he's still with the team. 8 of those 10 players have reasonable expectations to be active on game day. Obviously, one of those who doesn't is Shaka Toney. William Bradley King, Dax Milne kind of have the same, to me, kind of same odds of making the roster. So basically gave them like a half point each. So that's where I come up with 2 of the 10. Of course, it is possible that neither of them make it. Now you're talking 7 out of 10. Speaking of 7 out of 10, the rest of those guys, all 7 out of the 10 are expected to have significant roles on the 2023 roster. So 3 seasons in, 7 out of the 10 members of that class are expected to play significant roles. Last year's class, 8 players drafted, all 8 still with the team. All 8, I think, have reasonable expectations to make the roster. Christian Holmes could fall off due to the addition of Emmanuel Forbes and Quan Martin, but because he was on the roster for last season and he was active a good amount, I'm going to leave him in that group for right now. 6 of 8 are expected to have significant roles on this year's roster. That's where Christian Holmes kind of falls off, along with Chris Paul, who's supposed to be a backup. But he could also, there's a couple guys that kind of have a half pointer, just like I did with the other one, right? So that means that 92% of the players drafted by Washington from 2020 to now are still with the team. That's a very high hit rate and retention rate. 22 of those players, again, from 2020 to the 2022 NFL draft, have a reasonable chance to make Washington's active roster. Those 22 players would account for 42% of the Commanders' active roster if they were to indeed make the active roster. That's nearly half. So nearly half of your active players could potentially be on first-year deals or first contract deals, rookie deals, right? When you compare that to the NFL's worst, the Las Vegas Raiders, in 2020, they drafted 7 players. 1 of them is still with the team and expected to make the active roster. 2021, they drafted 7 more. Only 4 of them are remaining. 2022, they drafted 6. 3 of them are remaining. So that's 8 players from 2020 to 2022 compared to 22 players for the Commanders. And that's a 15% rate for the Raiders compared to the 42% rate for the Commanders. So a huge disparity there between, the Commanders near the top of the league and the Raiders at the bottom of the league. Add on to that, the Washington's 29 first-round pick that they still have on the team is Montez Sweat. His option was picked up while the Raiders declined Cleveland Farrell's, and that widens the gap a little bit, again, since the 5th-year option is still technically part of the rookie deal. So it's no surprise then that while the Commanders have one of the best rates of landing contributing players on rookie deals in recent times, they also have one of the lowest bonus payouts because of it. Vice versa, the Raiders have the league's worst rookie deal contribution rate, but they also have one of the highest top 51 veteran valuation numbers because of it, since they have to use so much veteran talent to fill in for where they wanted to have rookies rather than the other way around. The Commanders, they're putting some rookies and some young guys in positions where Raiders and other teams like that are putting veterans in, right? The Rams, who notoriously sold all their draft capital for veteran players, have the 30th ranked cap health overall, and they're worse than the league in veteran valuation and are number 28 in the league in rookie deal contribution. So the next time anybody screams about this team trying to trade draft capital for a veteran, just remember there is a balance to this stuff. There is such thing as too much. Of course, I would say there's too much either way as well. Additionally, Washington has key players and rookie deals in 4 of the top 6 positions in veteran salaries, obviously one of them including quarterback position. So the best way to stay healthy in the salary cap management is to spend money on keeping veterans that contribute in key roles and finding young talent to replace those who don't. We're going to look at 3 young players who could price out their veteran counterparts in the relatively near future. That's next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders. All right, now that we've looked at how Pro Football Focus comes up the Washington Commanders having the 9th healthiest salary cap situation coming into the season and forecasted over the next 3 years, we talked about how that's come to be. We talked about the contributions from the young players that I believe is a big catalyst for this. We got to look into the future, right? Because basically Ron Rivera, Martin Mayhew, the entire brain trust is kind of showing us is that is what they're looking to do. Bring in these young players. And this is what every NFL team wants to do, right? Bring in these young players, groom them, develop them, turn them into star players and contribute for your team. And then when the time comes for a contract situation, you basically look at your depth and you say, do we need to keep this guy or can we afford to let him walk? Because when you look at veterans who have expiring contracts in 2024, 25, and 26, so we're looking at 23, 24, 25, but all that money is going to roll into the 24, 5, 6 offseason, right? There are some young guys who could push to price out some of their veteran counterparts, right? Bottom line, rookie contracts are cheaper than veteran contracts. So, for example, top defensive tackle drafted in this year's NFL draft, Georgia's Jalen Carter, drafted by the Philadelphia Eagles, will cost the Philadelphia Eagles $3.96 million against cap this year and no more than $6.9 million in his first 4 seasons. That $6.9 million cap hit is scheduled to hit in his 4th year. Meanwhile, Daron Payne is going to count this year for $8.6 million against the salary cap and hit as high as $28 million against the cap in 4 years. So if Carter is as good as Daron Payne in 2026, the Commanders are going to pay about $21 million more for their guy than the Eagles will be paying for their guy. And then that's just one position. It's just one player. The whole thing is important, but it just kind of gives you an example. That's how dramatic keeping a young guy could be over signing a veteran or re-signing a veteran. So using that knowledge, you can see why sometimes teams will choose not to pay the veteran in favor of the young guy who could play at a similar talent level or better for much less. And sometimes, look, if I got a guy waiting in the wing who maybe this first season, I got 3 years left on his rookie deal. Maybe this first year, he's not as good, but year 2 or 3, he should be as good or better. I might let that veteran walk, save some of that money. It's a gamble, but if it pays off, I'm going to look like a genius. Of course, if it doesn't pay off, I might be looking for a new job. So using that knowledge, again, you can see why it happens sometimes. So here are 4 initial contract players. These 4 players are all on their rookie deals right now on Washington's roster who could push out their veteran counterparts who are going to want new deals before these rookie contracts expire. And the first and foremost, we got to talk about last year's first-round draft pick, Jahan Dotson, the wide receiver out of Penn State. And I think if you're a veteran on this roster who might be getting pushed out by Jahan Dotson, you're probably talking about Curtis Samuel, whose contract expires at the end of this season. He is a 2024 unrestricted free agent unless the Washington Commanders lock him up. There's really been zero talk about contract extensions. There hasn't been a hold-in, a holdout, nothing like that. Curtis Samuel, he's had one healthy season here in Washington, one unhealthy season here in Washington. Certainly a lot of dynamic abilities, certainly a lot of contributions he could present. But if Jahan works his way up to legitimate wide receiver 2 status this year from a production standpoint, not just a depth chart standpoint, then that's going to play a big role in this. Do you pay Curtis Samuel free agent money when you've got Jahan Dotson as your number 2 guy? The NFL draft is also always churning out new content or new talent, right? So you could always find another guy. Then you've also got De'Ami Brown. Can he take a step this year in his NFL development? If he can, could he become your number 3 receiver? Or we look at Marcus Kemp, a guy who's been impressive during OTAs, during the mandatory minicamp, and we'll see how he can develop, build a connection with Sam Howell as well. There is a reality where you look at Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, De'Ami Brown, Marcus Kemp, and a potential, say, 3rd, 4th round draft pick. That's a really solid 5 group wide receiver group if that draft pick turns out to be a very solid pick, just like the Commanders have done in recent times. Also, you kind of have to look at this too, right? Antonio Gibson versus Curtis Samuel. Could Antonio Gibson kind of be looked at as maybe you can do a little bit of that hybrid back receiver stuff, and maybe we can keep you cheaper because you've got a little bit more of a history. Plus, you've been here longer and relatively to your career than Curtis Samuel has. So this could also turn into almost Antonio Gibson versus Curtis Samuel. So maybe 2 players. Obviously, AG not going to be on his rookie deal anymore, but maybe you have a guy in Antonio Gibson and Jahan Dotson who can kind of pair up to potentially push Curtis Samuel off of the roster as early as this offseason. So that's 1 first-round draft pick, last year's first-round draft pick, but the other first-round draft pick we're going to look at is this year's first-round draft pick, and he could be pushing out veteran Kendall Fuller, and nobody's going to be surprised by this, right? Because as soon as he was picked, we started fielding questions. I started getting hit up on Twitter. I got an email about it here or there. I got a text about it here or there about what this meant for Kendall Fuller. And even then I kind of said, in the short term, I don't think it really means anything. But long-term wise, Kendall Fuller's contract expires at the end of the season, so he's also a 2024 unrestricted free agent. And if Emmanuel Forbes comes in here and shows starting caliber cornerback talent, Benjamin St-Juste continues to develop, not only could this happen, but this actually could be the team's plan. Like, they may be planning to do this from Jump Street and having a future cornerback trio of Emmanuel Forbes, Benjamin St-Juste, and Quan Martin, giving them 3 starting cornerbacks, all of them on rookie deals until 2026 offseason when St-Juste deal expires. So you basically get 2 years of all rookie deal cornerbacks. That's a very cheap secondary that you're having by making this move. So that's number 2. So that's 2 guys for 2024. But let's look at 2025. And I look at tight end Cole Turner potentially pushing tight end Logan Thomas out the door. Logan's getting a little bit hurt, a little bit older. He's been hurt more recently, obviously battling through some injuries. You love his leadership. You love his ability and his attitude, obviously his approach to the game. But if Cole Turner realizes some of the potential and the flashes we've seen in training camp last year, preseason, OTAs this year, minicamp, all that stuff, by this time, 2025, Logan Thomas could be retired or playing somewhere else, and Cole Turner could be your tight end number 1 with John Bates essentially playing second fiddle to him, and then whoever they draft from now to then, or bring in Armani Rogers, eventually will come back, those types of things. That is certainly a matchup to watch, not for necessarily 2024, but more for 2025. Finally, the fourth one, a 2026 free agent. And this is a guy who just got here, but I'm looking at Ricky Stromberg this year, one of the draft picks this year, center out of Arkansas, potentially pushing Nick Gates out the door in the 2026 offseason, because that's when Nick Gates' current contract expires. If Ricky Stromberg develops over the next couple of seasons, you could see the Commanders turn to their rookie deal center versus paying Nick Gates another contract. They let him move out. You have Ricky Stromberg still for another couple of seasons on a rookie deal. That maybe helps you pay, Sam Howell potentially if he's successful. So, of course, if the younger players accelerate their development, these veterans outside of Samuel and Fuller, because they're not getting released this year, could be on their way out sooner. For example, if the Washington Commanders wanted to release Logan Thomas next year, it would save them $7 million in salary cap space. Not saying it could happen or will happen, not even saying I wish it'll happen, just something to be aware of, looking at the way the Commanders have managed their salary cap and what it's produced, a top 10 salary cap as far as health is concerned. This is how they do it. So this is kind of where you see the future coming forward from the Washington Commanders roster. Speaking of the future, I will be back with you tomorrow to wrap up the week. In the meantime, if you've got questions or comments, just throw them in the YouTube comments, on Twitter, hit me up an email on @lockedoncommanders@gmail.com, or send them directly to me via subtext. As always, I want to thank you so much for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day, every day. Every day, thank you so much for coming through on a consistent basis like you do. And remember, you can continue the conversation with me over at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. Thank you so much for making me a part of your day, part of your routine. And if you have anything else Washington Commanders related you want to know or discuss, make sure you're also following me on Twitter at dharrison82. Until we speak again, please be safe, be kind, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.